Imagine, if you will, a world where idleness was the ultimate badge of honor. For men, accumulating vast wealth was the sign of success. For their wives, daughters, and mothers, the very absence of productive labor became the paramount demonstration of that success. A woman who lifted a finger in any gainful employment, or even in the actual management of her own household, risked instant social ruin. Her hands, soft and unblemished by toil, were living proof of her husband's immense financial prowess. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about signaling. Every moment she spent not working, every leisurely pursuit, every elaborate toilette screamed of wealth so profound it could afford to support her in utter, beautiful uselessness. This enforced idleness was not a burden. It was a carefully cultivated art form, a public performance of privilege. Something the astute sociologist Thorstein Veblen famously termed conspicuous leisure. Just so you know, the art of doing nothing conspicuously didn't just appear overnight, fully formed in the Gilded Age. Nope. From ancient Rome, where the wealthy patricians prized odium, a freedom from work, to medieval European nobility, whose exemption from manual labor distinguished them from the toiling serfs, the display of idleness as a mark of status was a recurring theme. Throughout history, the impracticality of one's attire or the presence of a vast retinue of servants served as clear indicators of a financial standing so immense that personal labor was entirely unnecessary. These historical precedents laid the groundwork for the elaborate expressions of non-productivity that would define Gilded Age high society. Let's begin with an account of the social rituals that devoured their days in the pursuit of leisure. The endless cycle of calls, receptions, teas, dinners, and balls. These weren't mere social engagements, they were gladiatorial contests of grandeur. A society ball, for instance, could cost more than a small mansion. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, hosted by Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissium Vanderbilt, is legendary. It wasn't just a party, it was a strategic assault on the established guard, a flamboyant declaration of arrival. Guests arrived in costumes so elaborate they were works of art themselves, including Alva, famously dressed as a Venetian princess, her gown reportedly costing thousands. The flowers, the catering, the musicians, the elaborate decor, every detail was meticulously planned to outshine the last. The sheer time investment required to orchestrate such an event was staggering. Hours spent with decorators, caterers, florists, dressmakers. Hours upon hours of fittings, discussions, and decisions, all culminating in a single night of dazzling display. And the effort wasn't just in hosting, it was in attending. Weeks could be spent preparing a single gown, selecting the perfect jewels, arranging elaborate hairstyles. Each attendee was a walking advertisement of her family's economic might, encased in satin, lace, and diamonds. Fashion, in particular, was a cruel mistress and a powerful weapon in this game of leisure. The Gilded Age silhouette was a testament to unproductivity. Skirts ballooned with multiple petticoats and bustles, sometimes requiring specialized furniture to sit down. Waists were cinched to improbable dimensions, making breathing difficult, let alone any vigorous activity. The sheer volume of fabric, the intricate lacework, the delicate embroideries, the heavy jewels, all screamed of wealth and an absolute detachment from any form of manual labor. Imagine trying to scrub a floor or even hail a cab in such an ensemble. It was impossible, and that was precisely the point. The more impractical the attire, the clearer the message. My family is so rich, I don't need to do anything. I am a living, breathing ornament. Each gown, each hat, each pair of gloves was a carefully curated symbol, a statement of status that was instantly recognizable to those who understood the unspoken language of luxury. And the cost? Unfathomable. A single ball gown could cost as much as an average worker earned in a year, or even several years. These were not clothes meant for comfort or utility, but for display, for performance, for the explicit purpose of proving one's worth in the social hierarchy. And then there were the conspicuous rules of etiquette and breeding, and formal and ceremonial observances, which were other demonstrations of unproductive and therefore leisurely uses of time. Social life was governed by an invisible but unbreakable code, meticulously detailed in publications like Florence Hartley's The Lady's Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness, 1860. This wasn't about simple politeness, but a complex tapestry of correct introductions, dinner party seating arrangements, morning rituals, and even the precise timing of social calls. Adhering to these elaborate, time-consuming conventions required endless practice and a constant dedication to superficial forms, effectively proving one's exemption from any sort of productive labor. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor herself, embodied this perfectly. Her formidable position as the gatekeeper of New York society was maintained not by a profession, but by her unwavering adherence to and enforcement of these rigid social protocols, dictating who was in and who was out based on an almost spiritual devotion to propriety and inherited social standing. Even patronage of the arts and philanthropy, seemingly noble pursuits, often served as another vehicle for conspicuous leisure. Building a grand opera house, endowing a museum, or funding a public library wasn't solely about civic duty. It was also a highly effective means of solidifying social standing and projecting an image of cultured refinement. The women of high society would dedicate countless hours to organizing fundraisers, serving on boards, and attending exclusive galas for these institutions. This involvement required significant leisure time that could otherwise be spent on domestic duties or productive labor. Which wasn't about to happen, of course. It allowed them to associate their names with cultural institutions, positioning themselves as intellectual and moral leaders, elevating their family's social cachet beyond mere financial success. A grand ball might be for pure display, but a meticulously planned charity bazaar combined display with a veneer of moral uprightness, making the leisure invested even more productive in terms of social capital. Indeed, leisure itself became a competitive sport. The drive to outdo one another was relentless. If Mrs. Astor hosted a dinner party for 20, Mrs. Vanderbilt might host one for 30. If one woman had a diamond necklace, another would acquire a larger one. This was the era of the 400, Ward McAllister's infamous list of those truly acceptable in New York society, a constantly shifting, fiercely guarded roster. Gaining entry and maintaining one's position required not just wealth, but the meticulous performance of leisure. It demanded an understanding of the unspoken rules, the subtle cues, the intricate dance of social engagement. Every tea visit, every carriage ride through Central Park, every box at the opera was an opportunity to be seen, to display one's elegance, one's access, and one's sheer ability to exist without effort. The competition wasn't about who could build a better railway or corner a market. It was about who could spend their time and money with greater extravagance, grace, and ostentation, signaling an even higher plane of existence. The seasonal migrations of the elite further cemented their dedication to conspicuous leisure. Summer meant Newport, Rhode Island, a seaside enclave transformed into a playground for the wealthy. Here, they built cottages that were, in fact, sprawling mansions boasting dozens of rooms, elaborate gardens, and ocean views. The summer season was a relentless whirl of garden parties, yacht races, private concerts, and elaborate picnics. The sheer logistics of moving an entire household, servants, horses, carriages, wardrobes, and countless personal effects, from city residences to these summer palaces, was a monumental undertaking, itself a testament to boundless resources. And then, as the leaves turned, many would embark on grand tours of Europe, doing the continent for months on end. They'd fill steamships with their entourages, descend upon grand hotels, and spend weeks purchasing haute couture in Paris, jewels in London, and art in Italy. Or perhaps they'd winter in warmer climes like Florida or the Riviera, escaping the harsh northern winters, always surrounded by their retinue of servants and fellow leisure seekers. These movements were not about seeking adventure or personal growth. They were about being seen in the right places, with the right people, engaging in the right kind of non-productive activities. Each migration was a visible declaration of freedom from the constraints of work, a testament to endless resources that could fund perpetual idleness and travel. And it wasn't good enough to just look, act, and embody the part. The acquisition of knowledge with no immediate real-world application became another subtle yet potent display of wealth and leisure. This wasn't about practical skills for commerce or industry. It was about demonstrating the luxury of intellectual pursuit for its own sake. Learning ancient Greek, mastering complex musical instruments, or collecting rare, obscure manuscripts. These required significant time and resources, proving one possessed the leisure to engage in such non-productive, scholarly endeavors. A prime example is J.P. Morgan, the titan of finance, whose immense wealth allowed him to amass one of the world's most significant private collections of rare books and manuscripts, later forming the core of the Pierpont Morgan Library. His dedication to acquiring these priceless artifacts, often more valuable for their historical or artistic significance than for any practical utility, underscored his family's ability to transcend mere accumulation of riches and instead indulge in the cultivation of refined, useless knowledge. Beyond their personal presentation, the wealthy also amassed tangible trophies of their leisure and financial might, vast collections of art, rare books, and antiquities. These weren't mere hobbies, they were strategic investments of both money and time, requiring extensive travel and connoisseurship, activities far removed from productive labor. William Henry Vanderbilt, for instance, accumulated an impressive collection of European paintings, which he prominently displayed in his opulent Fifth Avenue mansion. The very act of acquiring these masterpieces, often bought at exorbitant prices from overseas, and then showcasing them in private galleries within their homes, served as a powerful, silent declaration of their immense wealth and abundant leisure time, signaling a level of sophistication and detachment from the mundane world of commerce. Beneath the glittering surface of this conspicuous leisure lay an army of unseen hands. The immaculate gowns didn't simply appear. They were crafted by armies of seamstresses, laundresses, and ladies' maids. The sumptuous meals were prepared by battalions of chefs, cooks, and scullery maids. The grand mansions were maintained by armies of footmen, housekeepers, valets, and stable hands. The very ability of these high society women to perform their exquisite idleness was entirely dependent on the ceaseless labor of others. Their leisure was purchased, bought, and paid for not just with money, but with the sweat and toil of a vast domestic staff. This stark contrast between the visible leisure of the elite and the invisible labor that supported it further underscored the message. Their time was so valuable, so precious, that it could not be wasted on anything as mundane as work. It was a testament to the ultimate luxury, freedom from necessity, achieved through the subjugation of others' necessity. The Gilded Age woman, in her exquisite inactivity, was not merely enjoying herself, she was defining the boundaries of an elite class. Exclusivity was the goal, always the goal. In our next episode, we expose the real reason behind the debut ritual, where daughters were put on auction for the ultimate prize of solidifying family power and meticulously guarding the exclusive social identity of New York's Gilded Age elite.